So this week is Parshas Toldos, and before we start the Shiur today, the Shiur is dedicated to Ilui Nishmoso of the Rabbonis Yehudis Bas Reb Reuven. I assume that is a mother of our dear friend Dr. Freilich, whom I know for many years, and he did Aliyah some while ago. So the Shiur is dedicated to his mother, Yehudis Bas Reb Reuven. Born in Auschwitz, what a place to be born. Survived the Holocaust and was zeicha to raise a family in America. And she was zeicha to bonim, uvnei bonim, uvnei bnei bonim, a big family, all of them shoyim Torah u'mitzvahs. I mentioned last week was my mother's yortzeit, and she passed away 4 years ago. She was 93, she left more than 500 descendants, all shoyim Torah mitzvahs. And she used to say, that's my nachama, and that's my nakama, and I'm sure that your mother would say the same. And that was a generation of giants, a generation of people that going through all the horrors of the Holocaust, being able to find the strength and the courage and the dveikus to raise a healthy family. So the Torah we're learning today is Le'ilui Nishmosa of Rabbonis Yehudis Bas Reb Reuven. Hashem Yinkam Doma. She should be a Malitzas Yoisha for the beautiful family, and you should only know Nachas and Simcha La'orech Yomim. So this week we start to learn the story of Yaakov and Esav, and in the past 3 Parshas, primarily we learned about Avraham Avinu, and this week we learn about Yitzchak. And the story of Yaakov and Esav starts to unfold. And v'ye'ev Yitzchak es Esav kitzayed befiv, v'Rivka oheves es Yaakov. And it is obvious in this parsha that the one that fed Yitzchak was Esav. And when Yitzchak wants to give a bracha, he tells Esav, bring me food. Asayli mat'amim. And that is the pashtus kitzayed befiv. And we know that Kiyam Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Shaloi Nitno. And it is not only Avraham. There are many sources that the same applies to Yitzchak and to Yaakov. So how did Yitzchak rely on Esav's kashrus? Well, obviously he wasn't aware who the real Esav was. But the Gemara says in many sources in Shas, Behemton shel tzadikim ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevit tekol al yodam tzadikim atzman lo kol shekein. And it is a sugya mesechet b'choros and a sif in Shulchan Aruch in Yoredeya Kuf Samech Tet Sif Aleph. A person that doesn't keep a mitzvah has no nemonos on that mitzvah, and a person that doesn't eat kosher has no nemonos and is not trustworthy, and you cannot rely on his word regarding mitzvahs that he himself doesn't keep. And if Esav was a Rosha, as he obviously was, how did Yitzchak rely on his namonis by kashrus? So Minchas Osher, in various different sources, I discussed the various parameters of an amonah. Sometimes we rely on goyim, and there's a concept of uman lo mara nosei. A person won't damage his reputation, and if this is his livelihood and this is his profession, then we rely on him. But that rule doesn't apply to Esav. It wasn't his parnasa, it wasn't his profession, and sometimes we rely on doctors. And it is a Gemara in Nidadav Chav Beis, Omed Beis, Omer Rabbi Elazar Betzodik. Shnei Masem Hela Ovi Mitivon, and Masa Beishuacha, Shehoiso Mapila Kamin Sa'aroi Sadomois, Klipin Adumim, Sha'al was Abba Sha'al Chachomim, Chachomim Sha'alu et HaRovim. And this is what the doctor said. Maki Yesh Ba'oisei Mokem, Shemotzia Klippus Adumois, and she's not a nido. And this Gemara is the most important source that the poskim quote that we rely on doctors, whether it's in Hilchos Neder or in Hilchos Pikuach Nefesh. But once again, doctors, that is their profession. But it is a fundamental halacha that you cannot rely regarding kashrus and a person that doesn't keep kashrus. The Ramon Sivin Kuf Chavtes goes beyond that, and the Ramon writes a halacha that if you want to buy food from someone, he needs to be muchzak b'cheskes kashrus. If you want to eat in his home, it doesn't need to be muchzak b'cheskes kashrus, but you can't eat in his home if you know that he isn't observant. But in amonas and kashrus, a person that doesn't keep is not to be trusted. So whenever we have questions on the Ovois, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the Shvotim, it's just a platform and a springboard for discussion. We don't really have kashas on the Ovois. It was before Matan Torah, and even though Chazal say Kiyam Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Shelo Nitno, most of the great Achronim explain. The Gemara says, Kiyam Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Shelo Nitno Afilu Eruv Tavshilan. Does that mean that Avraham Avinu was booking all the Sharat Tziyons of the Mishnah Berurah and Siman Tov Kuf Chav Zayin, and all the machlokes between the Mogen Avraham and the Taz and the Chros of the Mishnah Berurah? What do Chazal mean when they say Kiyam Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Ad Sholei Nitno? So the Nefesh HaChaim, the Or HaChaim HaKodesh, and many others say it doesn't mean that Avraham Avinu kept all the little details of halachas. It means the fundamentals, the yesoides, the musar of the mitzvahs, probably the Kabbalah, the Tikkunim and the Yehudim. Sifrei Drush maintain, and their interpretation of the Mama Chazal is Kipshutoi. But that is primarily, as I said, as a platform for discussion, as a springboard for pilpul, and in my sefer as well. Many of the Simona Machumish Bereshis and Minchas Osher are based on Maaseh Avos. So, today's shir as well. I just want to discuss a Gevaldige Chiddush of Rav Moshe Feinstein regarding Nemonos Bakashas. And Rav Moshe wrote 4 tshuvas about this. The first 2 tshuvas are Igris Moshe, Or HaChaim, Chelek Aleph, Siman Lamed Aleph, and Siman Samech Hey. And Rav Moshe argues, and he's Machadish, one could rely on personal conviction when it comes to kashrus. So this shiur was written by Rav Moshe decades ago, I think 60 years ago, and he is referring primarily to the matzav in Russia, in which parents were from, and very few of their children were observant. And could parents eat in their children's homes, even though they know the children don't keep kashrus at all, they don't keep mitzvahs, but the parents are thoroughly convinced, my child, my son, or my daughter won't do this to me. And I know I could rely on their integrity, on their honesty, and on their kibbud av. They don't observe, they're not eating kosher, but on the personal level, I know my kids, and I am totally confident. If they say this is kosher, I rely on them. And Rav Moshe said, yes, you could rely on personal conviction. And that seems to be a Gevaldige Chiddush, and this is what we will be discussing today. So the fundamental source of Rav Moshe is a Gemara in Ksubas Daf Pei Hey Omid Aleph. Rava says, Bas Rav Chizda would tell me that a person is not trustworthy, I would be mahapech shavua al shekenegdoi. So this is a halach in Choshe Mishpat, which we won't go into the details, but if a person is chayiv shavua, and he is choshod al shavua, and Beis Din knows that you can't believe this person, he's a liar, and he doesn't care about a shavua's sheker, then we turn over the shavua to the other party. And instead of nishba v'niftar, the toveo will need to swear and is nishba v'noitel. And Rava says, I thoroughly rely on Basav Chizda. Kimli begava de lo mishakra. And I will trust her, even though there are no proper Eidim, there are no two Eidim that will testify that a person is Choshed al Shavua. I rely on Basav Chizda. Who was Basav Chizda? Well, coincidental, it was Rava's wife. Rava was the son-in-law of Rav Chizda, and Rava says, I rely on Basav Chizda. Why doesn't he say, I rely on Rava's wife? I rely on my wife. Because Rava said, the merit of his wife doesn't come from him, not because she's a Neishes Chava, but because she's a Bas Talmud Chacham. And her integrity and her tzidkis and her reliability doesn't come from me. It comes from the home where she was raised. It comes from her father. So Rava says, I rely on Basav Chizda. To passel a person, you need Shnei Eidim. And Rava says, if my wife says that she knows the person and you can't rely on him, that is enough for me. We find an exactly similar sugya in Yavamas Kuf Aleph Omid Beis. And Rav Yehuda says, I rely on Rav Shmuel ben Rav Yehuda, v'karanish Torah apiv. If he would tell me that a shtar is a shtar mezuyef, I would tear the shtar. And the Gemara says, how could that be? You need shnei eidim b'manes. Maranish Torah al piv. I wouldn't destroy the shtar, but I would be matal doifi, and I would say, you need to be makayim this shtar. So when Rava said, I rely on Bas Rav Chizda, and then there was a case in which Rav Papa testified that a person is posel, Choshed al Shavua, and Rava asked Rav Papa, do you have another aid? You're an Ed Echod. We need to aid him. And Rava was asked, your wife is more trustworthy than Rav Papa, who was one of the great Ameroim? And Rava says, I know my wife, and I know she would never lie. I don't know Rav Papa well enough, and therefore I can't rely on him. And a similar story is in Yavamas Kuf Aleph, when Rav Yehuda says, I rely on Rav Shmuel Rav Yehuda, he would never lie. And the Gemara says, it is only because he knew him personally, but the fact that a big tzaddik gives Eidus, we won't believe him. Which means it is personal conviction. So if the biggest tzaddik, if the biggest Rebbe, if the biggest Rosh Hashiva comes, and he testifies that this person is Choshed al Shavua, we would say we need Shnei Eidim. You might be a great man, but you need personal conviction. Bas Rav Chizda, yes. Rav Papa, no. Rav Shmuel Rav Yehuda, yes, because Rav Yehuda knows him. Any other gadol, no. So this Gemara is the basis to Rav Moshe's psak that a person could rely on personal conviction in kashrus as well. In my opinion, ein ledabois milsa la milsa, and I think Beis Din and dealings of Beis Din, there are different rules. And a dayan has the authority to apply personal conviction. There's a Rambam Perichov Dalad Aloha Aleph in Hilchos Sanhedrin, which is quoted in Choshe Mishpot Siman Tezvav Sif Hei. And I apologize for asking people to bring me Svarim, but that is the nature of our Shiurim. If there's either a Rambam Shoiftim or a Choshe Mishpot Chelek Aleph, what you find easier, either Choshe Mishpot Chelek Aleph or Rambam Shoiftim, because they're fundamentally the same. So the Rambam Perik Chav Daled in Hilchos Sanhedrin, this is a Choshe Mishpot, so it's in Hilchos Dayonim, Siman Tes Vav. And I am reading the Lashon of the Rambam. Yesh ledayin loden dina momenes al pi dvorim shedatoi noita lohem shem emes v'adov achozek beliboy shehu kach afar pi she'ein sham raya bruro. Yesh ledayin loden dina momenes al pi dvorim shedatoi noita lohem shem emes v'adov achozek beliboy shehu kach afar pi she'ein sham raya brura. This is not relying on a personal conviction that this person is trustworthy. It is more circumstantial evidence. The Dayan questions both parties, and he is convinced who is speaking the truth and who is lying. And the Dayan has the authority to give a psak based on his personal conviction, not believing a person and his testimony, but rather questioning the parties. And he has a clear feeling who's right and who's wrong, who is speaking truth and who is the one that is lying. And then the Rambam goes on and he says, Misharabo botedinam she'enam hagunim ubale bino. But in due time, when some dayanim were either lacked integrity or they lacked wisdom and they weren't smart enough, hiskimu shelo yahafchu shvua ela baraya brura v'lo yivgemu shtav yafsidu cheskosoy elo al pi eidos. So, even though fundamentally this is the authority, the power of a dayan, but when the standards of the dayanim was diminished, Botedin decided on their own, we will no longer apply this halacha. So I think Rav Chizda, Ksubis Pehei, Yavomis Kuf Aleph, that is a dayan in Beis Din. It has nothing to do with kashrus. This is Dina Mominis, and the reasoning is dayanim must have more tools than eidus. I'm an Av Beis Din for 25 years. I do not recall one tick that we decided al pi eidim ksherim. Because when deals are done, when money is invested, who's there? Partners, family members, employees that are getting paid. Usually there are no eidim ksherim around. And when a person kills another, his minig is not to look for two proper eidim and say, Atem eidai, and please look at what I am about to do. So there are very few cases that could actually be decided al pi eidim ksherim. So Chazal understood that a dayan, that a court needs authority, and he needs more tools to apply in order to do a din tzedek. But what does that have to do with kashrus? And if the Gemara says, and it's a sif in Shulchan Aruch, if a person doesn't observe kashrus, he has no namonas in kashrus, how do we know that a person could rely on personal conviction? If the only two Gemaras are Yavamis Kuf Aleph, Ksubis Pehei, and in both these Gemaras we're dealing with a dayan sitting in Beis Din, and we're dealing with Dina Mominis. I think this is similar to the Halacha and Choshen Mishpat Tezavav. It applies to the proceedings of a Beis Din and Dina Mominis, and not necessarily to Inyone Kashrus. Ksubis Chav Beis Umet Beis might be another source. And the Gemara deals with trei utrei. Two Eidim say a person died. Two Eidim said no, he did not die. And his woman married. Imnises lo teitzei. Lo tenose lechatchila, because it's trei v'trei. Two against two. We don't know whom to believe. One kat is lying, obviously, and we don't know which one. Imnises lo teitzei. And the Gemara asks, how could that be imnises lo teitzei? Haboaleya ba'oshem toli. It's a real suffix. Teitzvei is a suffix. How could we be matir a suffix of a isa koros, of an ashes ish? How do you say imnises lo teitzei? Benises le'echod mi eideya. She married one of the eidim that testified that the person died. So what? But against him, there are two other Eidim that said he did not die. And Mele, the Eid says, I know. But the woman doesn't know. And the Gemara says, Bo'oimerez borili. The Eid says, I saw that he died. So I am entitled to marry his wife. I know he died. But what about her? She didn't see. And the Gemara says, Oimeres Boreli. Machlaikes Rashi and Taisus. Rashi says, she says, I know that he died. How do you know? Because if he would be alive, he would come home. If he didn't come home, that means he's dead. Which is an interesting argument. There could be many reasons a person is not coming home, even though he is alive. The most problematic one probably would be, we might tell this lady, maybe he isn't coming home because you're alive, not because he's dead. Maybe he wasn't so happy with his shalom bayis, and therefore he's not coming home. Maybe he's maybe he's injured. Maybe he had a head injury and he's not mentally stable. There could be so many reasons a person doesn't come home. But Rashi says, I know he's dead because I know him. And if he would be alive, he would come home. The Ran disagrees with Rashi, and the Ran says, she says, I saw when he was killed. Just like the aide saw, I saw as well. I was there. So both husband and wife say, we know he's dead, and therefore Bezin doesn't intervene. And that is Borili. The third interpretation is the Tosis Yishonim. Tosis Yishonim says that the woman says, I know the aide, I know the person giving testimony, and I know he would never lie. So the Perish of the Tosis Yishonim would support the Moshe Feinstein's Psak. And we're not dealing with Dina Momenis. We're not dealing with Dina Momenis. We're dealing with Heter Isha Labala. This is fundamentally Yisra Heter. It's a Davar Shabiyerva. Could we rely on this Tosis Yishonim? No. For three reasons, no. One reason, Lo Tinose. It is only Amnisis Lo Teitze. Everybody agrees. The Gemara clearly says she can't get married. It is only B'di'evet. If they did get married, we don't mix in, we don't oppose, we don't separate them. But we'll never give a heter if it's Terei v'Terei. The other reason is, there are three Perushim in Rishonim. And in Even Ezer, most of the poskim don't even quote the Tosis Yishonim, just Rashi and the Ran. And Tosis Yishonim is one pshat out of three. So who says, Halacha kemoisai? So we're still looking for other sources to substantiate the Moshe's Psak that regarding Kashas, one could rely on personal conviction. So going back,
So the heter is really more kal than Momenis. Because Momenis are Bishnaim Edim Yokum Dovo, or Edefan on Yisurim.
And that is why I explained before, it is not only a question of Kula and Chumra. I think there are special rules for Beis Din, because Beis Din needs tools to do Tzedek or Mishpat. Beis Din has a job to do. And in most cases, Beis Din can't rely on a Raya Brura, which means Eidim. And that is why we find so many Chazokas in Momenis. Chazaka ein odem toveya ele imken yesh loy. Chazaka ein odem poreya toich zmanoi. Chazaka ein odem meyes ponov befnei balchoivoy. These are all assumptions, because Chazal understood that a Beis Din, to justify its existence and to fulfill its duties, needs tools. And that is why a Dayan sheyoshev bedin, and he questions the parties, and he reaches conviction, and he knows who's right and who's wrong, that is his authority. Not necessarily that the same would apply to Issa v'Heter. You're right fundamentally, because by Momenis al Pishnei Maidim Yukum Davar, Ed Echod Ne'aman B'Yisurin. But even in Momenis, you need Shnei Eidim Lahoitzi Mamoin. But even in Ed Echod is Ne'aman Lahatel Shavua. There are many halachas in Dina Momenis as well, in which Shnei Eidim are not necessary. But fundamentally, what I try to explain is that in the authority of a Dayan, there is more room for personal belief and conviction than there is in Issa v'Heter. This is a gavaldig chiddush if the halacha is a person that is not observant, has no nemonis, to say that you could rely on personal conviction is a chiddush in which we need rayas. So the Moshe brings dina momenis, and I say that is not a raya. The other source I brought, the Ksubas Chov Beis, we're dealing with the Dovish Abiyeva. So lahayed shemei zabalo and edechod is neman, just like it's a veheter and edechod is neman. But here we have trei v'trei, so that's a real suffix. V'yafar piken borili is enough, but there are three different interpretations what borili means. Source number 3 would be a Gemara in Psochim Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, and the Gemara says there, an Eid Echad that saw a person did an Aveira is not allowed to come to Bezin to tell the story because he has no Nemonis. And if he has no Nemonis, it's Lashon Hara. So why would you come to Bezin? You know that Bezin can do nothing with your testimony because you're an Eid Echad. Nobody else was there. So why just talk Lashon Hara? But then the Gemara asks, could I tell my Rebbe? Could I tell my Rebbe? And the Gemara says, if your Rebbe will trust you, kishnei eidim, then tell him. But if your Rebbe won't really believe you, because he doesn't consider you a ish nemon, then it's Lashon Hara, then don't tell him. So this Gemara proves, but if my Rebbe will believe me, that would not be considered Lashon Hara. Because if the Rebbe believes me, then he could act on personal conviction. What would he do? Well, he might kick the boy out of yeshiva. I hope he doesn't. That should always be the last resort. So we don't know exactly what the scenario is. But the Gemara does say once again, Neman olav kibei trei. If the person you're going to speak negatively to, about another, won't believe you, then it's Lashon Hara. But you could share the information with your Rebbe if you know that he will trust you. So does this once again prove that a person could rely on an Eid Echad, even one that is posul Eidis, out of personal conviction? Once again, I don't think so, because why was the question asked, could I tell my Rebbe, and not could I tell my brother or my sister or my dad or anyone else? Obviously, we're dealing with a Talmud that wants to share this information with his Rebbe. I saw one of our guys in yeshiva doing something awful, because it is the Rebbe's responsibility to take action, to talk to the boy, maybe punish him, maybe try to rectify what he's doing. And that is why the question wasn't asked, could I tell anybody? You can't tell anybody, even if you will believe you. And that is why the question was asked, could I tell the Rebbe? So you could tell your Rebbe if your Rebbe will believe you, because at the end of the day, you're doing a Maaseh Tov. You're caring for this boy. And whatever the Rebbe decides to do with this information, you trust him, he's going to do the right thing. So once again, this does not prove that lekula, one could rely on personal conviction. So just a general comment, which is a heartwarming comment. So the Moshe deals with the question whether parents that are observant could rely on their non-frum children. I was asked this same question 100 times, but always the other way around. Could frum children rely on their non-frum parents? So Baruch Hashem, we live in another day and age, and usually these questions are asked the other way around by thousands of from youngsters, Bali Tshuva, whose parents aren't there yet and whose parents are not observant, but the kids know their parents. Yeah, I know my mom and I know my father, and I trust them 100%, and they'll never do this to me. You know, they respect my choice. So Baruch Hashem, it's the same question and the same dilemma, but it's just the other way around. So Sugya number 3, once again, is a Talmud sharing information with his Rebbe. 170 years ago, there was a huge controversy in the halachic world about the Barditchev Shoichet. There was a Shoichet in Barditchev, and there were rumors that he's not Erlich. He worked too fast. He shechted far more animals than all the others in his profession. And he was also a boydek. And there were very few cows that were treifa, far less than by other sheichtim. But nobody had hard evidence that he is puzzle. Reb Shlomo Kluger was invited to overlook his shchita. And Reb Shlomo Kluger came to Berditchev for a week, and he visited the Shlachthaus a few times. He made no comment. He went back to Brod, and from Brod, he wrote a letter, a psak, that the shochet is puzzle, he's not trustworthy, and you need to fire him immediately, and he could never be a shochet again anywhere. And the shochet turned to one of the other gedolim of that same period, Reb Enzel Mistri. He was the greatest Talmud of the Ktsois HaChoshen. He published the Avnei Miluim after the Ktsois HaChoshen passed away. And he has a sefer, Sharas Tshuvas Mariaz Enzel. Anybody that remembers his name has a good memory. His name was Rabbi Kesiel Osher Zalman Enzel Tzazmir, and he was Rav in Stri, in a town in Galicia, Stri. And the Sharas Tshuvas is Mariaz Enzel. And he supported the Shoichet. And he said, if Reb Shlomo Kluger is right, Tzorechi and Godel, you were a week in Berditchev, you said nothing. And then you go home and you write a letter that is puzzle, then you were machshel sarabim. You should have made a machor right then and there. This person shechted many animals every day, many cows, and you saw, and you say he's puzzle, so why didn't you tell the town right away you can't eat the shchita? How did you take this responsibility? And Reb Shlomo Kluger argued, and he said, this is a dangerous person. I was afraid for my life, so I could say nothing until I'm safely back home in Berditchev. And most of the Gedolim of that era took part in this controversy. And one of the fundamental questions was, Reb Shlomo Kluger is an Ed Echod. Could you passel a person as an Ed Echod? But others said, yes, Reb Shlomo Kluger is an Ed Echod, but he's a Gadol Ador. And we know, we trust him. He won't lie, and he has no personal agenda. And that was part of a huge controversy. Minchas Osha, Shalosh Tshuvas Chelik Daled, there's a siman about the controversy about the Shoichet me Berditchev. I don't remember which siman it is, and don't look for the sefer because it's not printed yet. So you won't find it. But I very much hope that in the very near future the sefer will be coming out, and there's an interesting, fascinating siman about the discussion of the Shoichet me Berditchev. I think that Moshe is right, and I brought two sources that nobody else brings to substantiate the Moshe's psak. And two sources where nobody would look for them. One in Hilchas Korban Pesach, and the other in Hilchas Psulei HaMukdoshin. Kosev Rambam in Hilchas Korban Pesach, Perik Daled Halacha Aleph. Kvar nizbayer behilchas Psulei HaMikdoshin, and soon we'll get to Psulei HaMikdoshin. Shapesach ein nishchot elo l'shem Pesach v'l'shem ba'olav. V'mshachti b'machsheves sheni Hashem posel. Sheni Kodesh and Sheni Hashem both pasel a korban. If the Shoichet had intention for another korban, not Pesach, but Chatas, it's posel. If he had intention to shech the korban for other Baalim, it's posel. HaShoichet is a Pesach HaBnei Chavura, ואמר להם לאחר זמן, אוי זה הפסח ששחטתי עליכם שלא לשמו שחטתיו. The shochet, after 2 or 3 hours, tells the Bnei Chabura, I regret it, but I want you to know, I shechted your korban shelo lishmo, and you weren't yoitze. It's a korban posel. Einoi nemon. Im hoyu nemon lohem, somchim al devorov, and they bring another korban. Ve'im alav, if they don't believe him, shuras adin, she'einoi nemon. He has no nemonas to pass a korban because it's no longer tachas yodoi. And therefore, when he tells the Bnei Chavura, I want you to know, your korban was puzzle, you need to bring another korban. He has no nemonas, they don't need to believe him. But im hoyu ne'eman aleim, they bring another korban. And that's a kula, and not a chumrah. If you bring 2 korban pesachs, that's chulin la'azorah, and that's an aveda. And he has no nemonos. But if it's ne'eman aleim, soim chamorav, and they bring another korban. This is not a dayan and dina mominis. This is issa v'heter. He has no nemonos fundamentally, because there's a chazaka that the Pesach is kosher. This is based on a Gemara in Gittin. If a Sefer wrote a Sefer Torah, and the Achaz man, he says, I wasn't lechaven lishmo when I wrote the Shemus, he has no nemonas. You're not going to get paid, but the Sefer Torah is a Sefer Torah kosher. Same rule applies to Korban Pesach. He has no nemonas. And nevertheless, the Rambam writes, Im hoyu ne'eman aleim, soim chemolov. And the same halacha appears in Hilchas Psula Mikdoshin, Perek Yutes, halacha Tezvav. Hoyu makrev imoi bezvochim, va'omeroi nispaglu. Oise imoi betaharois, va'omeroi nitma'u ne'emon. Loi nechshedi yisor al kach. אבל אם אומר זבוכם שקרבתי לכו באויסה היום, לאחר זמן, נספג לו, ואויסה לטהרס נטמעו, אם היו נאמן לוי, סומך על דבריו, ואם לאו, שורס הדין, שאינו נאמן. So in these 2 halachas, we find, person has no nemonis to pass the korban, whether it's korban Pesach or any other korban liachar hazman. But if the Balei korban believes him, then he brings another korban, which means that's personal conviction. If I believe him, I can act al piv and bring another korban, even though it's a kula, because me'ikar adin he has no nemonas. So I think these 2 halachas would be a makor to the Rambam. The Kesef Mishnah and the Lecha Mishnah both struggle to explain the Rambam. But the Netziv, in many different sources, understood the Rambam just as I just explained. And this proves that a person could rely on his personal conviction, believing in other person, even when it's a kula and not a chumrah. Meishiv Dova Chelik Aleph Semach Ofei, Chelik Beis Siman Aleph and Siman Hey, and then it's Siv Al Hashas, Yuma, Pei Gomel Amud Aleph, Kiddushin Yud Beis, and the 3rd Sefer of the Netziv, Hemek Shal and the She'iltas, She'ilta Chov Zayin. So, I think this Rambam and these 2 Rambams would prove that Reb Moshe is right, even though Reb Moshe brings another source, which is questionable. In Tshuvas HaTashbitz, we find a fascinating disagreement between the Tashbitz and the Rivash. These 2 were great Gedolim that fled Spain when the Tzoros began, before the Inquisition was in full force. They fled Spain and they arrived in Northern Africa, in Algiers. And that is when Torah started to flourish in Northern Africa, first in Algiers and then in Morocco. And these 2 great Gedolim left Spain, arrived in Africa. The Tashbitz was the elderly, and the Rivash, and the Tashbitz was somewhat of a Talmud Chovet to the Rivash. They had a very complicated relationship, the Rivash and the Tashbitz. And in Shuvas Tashbitz, Chelik Beisim Reish Aleph and Chelik Gimel Semepei Gimel, we find an interesting discussion between the Rivash and the Tashbitz, and that is regarding the Anusim, the Meranos. And the Rivash knew one of them, and he relied on him, on his kashas, on his standards, that his wine is kosher wine, and the Rivash Ba'an Vasanusoi turns to the Tashbitz and he asks for his opinion. Well, he might not be observant, I wouldn't know, but I trust him. And the Rivash says, I think I could rely on him, and the Tashbitz disagrees. And the Tashbitz says, well, if you're not confident that he's observant, and probably he is not observant, as many of the Jews were, even those that held some mitzvahs, in concealment, and there seems to be a machlokes between the Rivash and the Tashbitz, and the Rivash clearly is of the opinion of Moshe Feinstein that I could rely on my personal conviction knowing this person. Tshuva number 3 of Moshe is in Yoreh Derech Chelik Beis Mem Gimel, and Moshe deals with a question. A person is known to the community as a person that is a ish ne'aman. Could we rely on him regarding kashrus? And Moshe says, only family members, like Basar of Chizda. It's of Chizda because it was his wife. And people know their family members in a very intimate way. But if he's not a family member, you cannot rely on him. Which is a strange psak. Toiv shochan korov ma'ach rochoik. Some people know each other. You know a friend as well as you know a brother. And Rava argues, Basar of Chizda. But when Rava was challenged, why don't you believe Rav Papa? He didn't say, because the Basar of Chizda is my wife. He said, I know Basar of Chizda, I know my wife personally in a very intimate way, and I know she wouldn't lie. Rav Chizda is one of the Gedolei Ador, but I don't know him. And if I don't know him, I cannot rely on his edus because he's an Edechod. So that proves that this halacha doesn't necessarily apply only to family members. And the other story, Rav Yehuda and Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, they were not family members. They weren't related. And Rav Yehuda says, but I know he wouldn't lie. So I don't think this rule would apply only to family members. But I do agree that you need a very close relationship to have personal conviction, knowing the person. And it is not enough that he has a good reputation and everybody thinks he's a great guy. It needs to be intimate knowledge and personal conviction, and only then will this kula apply. Another ha'orah that I have on Rav Moshe deals with the question: a person gave a hechsher. Could he rely on his son to supervise some of the sites? And his son wasn't from. But his father said, I know my son and he's totally reliable. And I feel that the heter of personal conviction is only for the individual that has this conviction. It bears no relevance to others. You could rely on your personal conviction, but how could you give a hechsher when the person supervising isn't from? To me, this seems to be outrageous, to send a non-from person to give a hechsher, and personal conviction would be totally irrelevant. And as I said before, Rava is a dayan, and Dina Mominus it's different. It is the dayan's authority. This is my psak, even though it affects others. But regarding kashrus, you could rely on a person because you trust that he won't lie. But that conviction means nothing to others because you cannot give edus that he's Naaman. That is personal. So I don't think that would apply to any others.
So according to that, the schedule parents are not religious, couldn't invite a guest to be his parents?
I don't know. According to my opinion, no. Because your guest doesn't know your parents. According to the Moshe, obviously, yes. I would think no. So, the Rambam in Korban Pesach and Absula Mikdoshin, which to me, those are the two most important sources to substantiate the Moshe's Psak. And those two sources, it is only the Bnei HaChavura and the Baalei HaKorban that say, we trust the Shochet. And we know that he's saying the truth. And it affects no one else. And only in that case would I say one could rely on personal conviction. So this is a very common question in our day and age. In the days of Rav Moshe, it was a very troubling question, but that was the reality in those days. And in most cases, in our day and age, it's the other way around. It is from children that want to go visit their parents and eat in their parents' home, and the kids say, and the children say, we know our parents, and they would never, ever lie. So in this week's Parsha, coming back to the story of Yaakov and Esav, a gewaltige Yismach Moshe b'derech drash, which is, I like it and it's fascinating, and I heard it from my Rebbe some, I would say almost probably 55 years ago when I was a bocher in yeshiva. So the Kloisenberger Rebbe as well as the Satmar Rebbe, they are descendants of the Yismach Moshe. The Moshe Teitelbaum from El, and he was the head of the dynasty of Satmar, of Sigit, all the Teitelbaums, and many of the Halbshtams. And the Yismach Moshe was a chosed of the Chosim Rublin, and in his young age he was a Misnagid, and he wrote Shalosh Teshuvas Heishav Moshe, which is a gewaldige sefer, not because he was a Misnagid, but happens to be that he was one of the greatest Gedolim of his time, and he has an interesting approach to the story of Yaakov and Esav, and he asks, Shchitas Momer Posul, and the Gemara in Kedushin Yud Zayin says that Esav was a Yisrael Mumar, so a Shchita is Nevela. How come Yaakov Yitzchak Avinu eats Nevela? And I mentioned this Mama Chazal at the beginning of the Shiur. Be'emtem shel tzadikim ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevi tekol al yodam tzadikim atzmam lo kol shekain. So the Yismach Moshe writes, Esav was a Rasha. But it is obvious in Midrash Chazal that he had kibud av. And Esav would never be mashal his father to eat nevela. So whenever Esav would catch an animal in the wild, he would bring it to Yaakov Avinu to shech the animal. And Yaakov was happy to cooperate because he didn't want Chas v'Sholom, his father Yitzchak, the great tzaddik, to eat nevela. So Esav used to catch the animals. He didn't shoot them. He didn't kill them. He caught the animals. He brought, Yaakov was the shochet. And the Yismach Moshe writes, a big tzaddik, when he eats meat, he could feel the Yireh Shamayim of the shochet. I'm not there yet. What should I say? When I eat meat, I eat meat. But the Yismach Moshe says, real tzaddikim, when you eat a piece of meat, you could know whether the shochet is a tzaddik or not. And that is why the Yitzchak oyev es Esav ki tzayid bepiv. Yitzchak eats Esav's tzayid. So all the Lashon Haras that Rivka tried to tell Yitzchak and all the others only convince Yitzchak that Esav is a far greater tzaddik. He's a tzaddik nistar. I eat his meat, and no one could tell me that he's a Rasha. Every day when I eat his steak that he brings me every night, I feel a reach Gan Eden, Yitzchak says. So whatever you're going to tell me about Esav just will convince me what a tzaddik nistar is and what a great tzaddik is. The first time Esav comes back from the Soda, he looks for his shochet. Shochet is nowhere to be found because Yaakov runs away. He hides from Esav because he already fed Yitzchak. And then Esav comes and he says, Abba, v'yaz gam hu matamim, yokom avi v'yochel metzayed benoi. V'yecher ad Yitzchak charodi gedoyle ad ma'oid. And he says, just a minute. Who are you? He says, I'm Esav, your son. So who is the guy that brought me meat before? I thought that was you. It had the same taste that it had all these years. It wasn't you. V'yechad Yitzchak charodi gedoyle. Suddenly it dawned upon him, something is wrong here. And Yitzchak, Yechad Charodi Galan, he says, Mi Eifa Hu Atzad Sayid, V'yoveli V'oichai. All these years, not only right now. The person that brought me food before, that was your food, no? And Esav says, no, it wasn't me. V'yechad Yitzchak Charodi Gadoilo. So that's the Yismach Moshe on this week's Parsha, which is brilliant. So at what stage does a person eating meat could feel who the Sheikhet was? So the Kloisenberg Rebbe used to tell a story about the Yismach Moshe. An interesting story. So the Yismach Moshe was a younger man, and in those days you didn't have a 3-room apartment or not even a Yechidat Dior. He lived in a small room. There was a curtain in the middle of the room, and the bedroom was on one side of the curtain, the kitchen was on the other side of the curtain. So he used to come home from Beis Medrash late at night, and it was dark. He didn't want to put on the lights because his wife was asleep behind the curtain. So she used to prepare supper for him, a bowl of soup and a piece of meat in that bowl. One day in the morning, she gets up in the morning and she sees he didn't touch the food. And then she goes over to the Scotch Brite and the soap water, and it's empty. She prepared yesterday night, the shmata to clean the dishes, and nothing there. So she understood that by mistake, he ate that rag which you wash the dishes, and he thought it's the soup, and he ate the water with the soap that she prepared to clean the dishes. So she waits for him by night, and she says, how was supper yesterday night? Was it okay? And he said, well, I chewed the meat and it didn't dissolve, so I just swallowed it as is, but it was good. So that's the story the Kloisenberg tells about the Yismach Moshe. And I say, when you no longer feel the taste of a good piece of meat and a good bowl of soup, and you could confuse a rag for a piece of meat and soap water for chicken soup, at that stage you feel the time of the Sheikhet. As long as you feel the time of the meat, you can't feel the time of the Sheikhet. So these two Yismach Moshes are two sides of the same coin. So today we discussed the sugya of Ne'emonus, somewhat related to the story of Yaakov and Esav and Yitzchak. So this week's Parsha is about two momentous events. Number one is the B'choira. When Esav comes back from the field, Oyev v'yogeya, and he begs Yaakov, Aliteinu mina odam hazeh. And Yaakov takes advantage of Esav's desperation, and he says, I'll happily give you, but just sign this document. And Esav says, what is it? What do you want me to sign? And Yaakov says, we'll talk about it later, but I want to give you food. I know you're terribly hungry. Just sign. And Esav signs, and that's how Yaakov buys the B'choira. Torah says Yaakov is ishtam yoshev aholim. Doesn't seem to be such a tam. And the second story is even more problematic. When Yaakov conspires together with Rivka to fool the old man who is blind and pretend to be Esav, and Yitzchak is somewhat hesitant, and he says, please come here, I want to touch you. He feels that something might be going on here, and Yaakov says, yes, I am your son, Anochi bincha. How do we understand these parshios? This is a parsha we need to learn with the Zohar. It is always kedai to learn the Zohar, but here it's essential. I don't think we can understand this parsha without the Zohar. And the Zohar teaches us some fundamentals. The reason Yaakov needs the Bechorah has nothing to do with money, has nothing to do with Pishnayim. Yaakov needs the brachas, and he knows that the brachas will go to the Bechorah. Yaakov knows that he actually is the Bechorah, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, B'ni Bechori Yisrael. But he can't convince Esav that he is the Bechorah, and the brachas are becoming to him. Bracha and Bechorah are the same letters, writes the Zohar. And the brachas will go to the Bechor, and that is why Yaakov Avinu needs the Bechorah. And why does he need the brachas? So the Zohar says, Yaakov Avinu was benched 4 times during his lifetime. The most important brachas were those of this week's parsha, those that Yitzchak benches Yaakov, thinking that he's Esav. The second set of brachas is in Parshas Vayishlach. Vaya'ovek ish emoy. When Yaakov battles, Sorei shel Esav, an angel of fire. V'yomer shalchayni ki oro hashachar, and Yaakov says, Lo yashalechacho ad asher berachtono. And Sorei shel Esav gives him another set of brachas. When Yitzchak tells Yaakov, go to Lavan because your life is in danger, Vayavorech Oisai. Yitzchak benches Yaakov once again. And Yaakov is on the way to Padan Aram. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once again, he has a revelation, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu benches him. So Yaakov achieved 4 sets of brachas during his lifetime, and the Zohar Kodesh says, the lesser of all the brachas, which is the brachas Yitzchak benches Yaakov when he sends him to Lavan, Yaakov take for himself. In all his trials and tribulations and all the difficulty he will endure with Esav, with Lavan, with Yosef. And the 3 other brachas, Yaakov doesn't touch. And he gives them to Klal Yisrael Deroisov. And we were nigal from Mitzrayim, in the schus of 1 set of brachas Yaakov Avinu gave us. Geulas, we went out of Golas Bavel, and we were zoichet to Bayesheni in the schus of another set of brachas. And the brachas Yaakov achieved instead of Esav still are untouched. And it is only in the merit of those brachas that we will be zoichet to Keitzei Amin and to the Geula Shalema. And Yaakov knows all this beruach HaKodesh. It is not about him. Yaakov has no personal benefit from these brachas. Yaakov knows that this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's master plan, and this is the way it needs to be. And this is the way it needs to unfold. For Yaakov, this is Mesiras Nefesh. He was a Ishtam Yoshev Ahorim. It goes entirely against his nature. He's also putting his life in jeopardy, and he is afraid, and he asks Rivka, Ulai yemeshani ovi, v'hevesi olai klola v'loi brocha. Why do I need to do this? And Rivka says, Olai kilalascha. Do as I tell you. This is the way it needs to be. So the brachas of Yaakov Avinu, it is only in the source of these brachas that Klal Yisrael will be zoicha to the Geula Shalem. And I still ask, after learning the Zohar, but why does it need to be this way? Why was that min hashamayim? Why does Yaakov need to cheat to achieve these brachas? Why was that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan? So the Navi says, and we read that in the next of Torah, Ahavti eschem, Omer Hashem, v'amartem b'meh ahavtoni. Halo ach Esav liYaakov, v'oyev es Yaakov es Esav suneisi. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I love you. B'meh ahavtoni. Esav and Yaakov are brothers. What is the difference between the two when I love Yaakov and I don't love Esav? And B'shas Kriyas Yamsef, the Medrash says, Sarah Shem Yam says, Halo love the Avodah Zarah, but I love the Avodah Zarah. What is the difference? They're the same. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says no, and these guys of the Yam should split. A time will come in the future, it won't be so obvious who's Esav and who is Yaakov. It won't be so obvious that Yaakov deserves more Rachamei Shamayim than Esav. And that is why these brachas that ultimately will lead the brachas of the Geula Shalema, Yaakov achieved when he looked exactly like Esav. And Yitzchak actually thought that he's benching Esav and he was benching Yaakov. That is the way it needs to be. These brachas need to be Yaakov's even when and if, chas v'sholem, he will look just like Esav. And it wouldn't be obvious why Yaakov deserves these brachas more than Esav. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, love is beyond reason. Ohavti eschem ne'um Hashem. Ach Esav leYaakov, va'ohav es Yaakov es Esav sunesi. And that is the way it was. That is why it was min hashamayim that Yaakov is going to get these brachas. Not because he is Yaakov. To Yitzchak he appeared to be Esav, and Yitzchak benched him. So these brachas will be Yaakov's in all circumstances, in all times, regardless of how Yaakov will seem to be. So these two stories, the Bechorah and the Bracha, are not about Yaakov. To him it was Mesiras Nefesh. But Rivka told him, and they knew, this is the way it needs to be. And these brachas rightfully belong to Yaakov, to Bnei B'chor Yisrael. And this is Ritzayin Hashem. So we are desperately waiting for the fulfillment and the manifestation of these brachas of this week's Parsha. We should be Zoicha B'Kora B'Yameinu, that these brachas should finally be fulfilled. I don't remember whether I shared this thought with you recently, but it's a gewaldige Wort, so it's always kedai to share again. Mitzvah Shabbos Kodesh, the Sudas Malav Amalka, as all the three Sudas Shabbos. There are a lot of Zmiras. But what is unique about Mitzvah Shabbos Malav Amalka is there is a Zemer for two individuals, which we do not have, Leil Shabbos, Shabbos in the morning, or by Shalosh Shudas. There is one Zemer L'Kvodah Shel Yaakov Avinu, and another one L'Kvodah Shel Eliyahu Hanavi. Why is that? Rashi brings in Parshas Bechukoisai. B'chamisha Makoim is Kasuv, Yaakov Moleh v'Yaisov Chosor. 5 times in Tanakh Yaakov is written with a Vav, and 5 times in Tanakh Eliyahu lacks a Vav. One of the 5 times is the famous Posek, Hinei Onoichi Sholech Lechem, it's Eliyahu Hanavi, Lefnei Bo Yoim Hashem HaGodel V'Anoira V'Heshev Le'evo V'Salboni. Iravoin Lakach Yaakov Avinu Eliyahu. Eliyahu promises Yaakov, I will come and I will be the Mevasa Shalom at the end of days. But Yaakov is the one that brought about the Geula. That was Yaakov's avoid. And that's why Yaakov takes a mashkoin from Eliyahu. And the Maral explains why Vav and why 5, not 4 or 3 or 6 or 7. And why the Vav, not Aleph, Beis, Gimel or Zayin, Chestes. The Maral says, on the hand of a human being there are 5 fingers. And of all the letters of Aleph, Beis, the only one that resembles a finger is a Vav. And that's a remes to a Tkiyas Kaf. Yaakov demanded that Eliyahu swears to him. A promise wasn't enough. And Eliyahu gave Yaakov a Tkiyas Kaf, and that is the remes of the Chamishu Vavim that Yaakov takes from Eliyahu. Shit alfin shnin have alma. That's a Gemara 3 times in Shas, Avodah Zarah, Shona, and Sanhedrin. Ubishvi Chorev. Mitzvah Shabbos Malava Malka is called Sudas David Malka Mashiach, and that is after Shabbos Kodesh. Shabbos Kodesh is the Elef HaShvi'i, and that is the Elef of Geula. So Mitzvah Shabbos by Sudas David Malka Mashiach, we sing to Yankov Avinu, Al Tiru Avdi Yankov, don't be afraid, Eliyahu will keep his promise, and you will give back those 5 Vavim. Ultimately. And then we sing a Zema for Eliyahu Hanavi, because he is the one that B'Korah B'Yameinu Yavoi V'Yavasa Geula L'Yisrael. So those are the 2 Zmiris of Mitzvah Shabbos Sudas David Malka Mashiach. Let us hope that B'Korah B'Yameinu Eliyahu will get his 5 Vavim back, and Yaakov will happily give back that Pekodin, and we will be Zoicha finally. Hinei onoichi sholeach lachem es Eliyahu Hanavi lefnei bo yoyim Hashem hagodol v'anoira v'hishav leivo v'salbonim v'leivbonim ala voisom bebias goyel tzedek b'mheiro v'yomeinu amen.